I'll call to order the April meeting of the Oil Heritage Desk and Derrick Club. I'm Dave Hotchkiss, club president. We are privileged this evening to have as our speaker Lee Deeter, the Meet You manager at the Drakewell Museum and Park. That program handles, they travel to things like fairs and schools, and have an educational program concerning the history of the oil industry. Lee's going to speak this evening on the history of the town of Pithole, Pennsylvania. Lee, you have the floor. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everybody. I actually came to Drakewell as an intern, as part of my history degree, and that was in the winter. And then in the summertime, they called me and asked me if I'd be interested in coming back to run the visitor center out at Pithole. And it's got a really interesting story, and there's lots of interesting stuff going on there. And I still like to research it and read about it and all that kind of fun stuff. So I put together a presentation that shows off a lot of the pictures. I do love the old pictures. Drakewell has a collection of over 10,000 historic photographs. Many of them are on glass plate negatives and lots of stuff. We are thankful to have a wonderful photographer, a darkroom photographer that comes in and can develop those for us, and print them for us, and so we can still look at them, enjoy them, and use them digitally. And we're in the process of digitizing all of them. We're almost through, but I've got a lot of them on the presentation tonight, so hopefully you enjoy those. We'll talk about them a little bit. I start with my title slide there. This is just our mission statements, and I do need to say about Pithole that it is owned by the state. It is operated by the Friends of Drakewell, which is my employer. That's our associate group. We're a nonprofit that works along with the museum. We take care of their education, their membership, and things like that. So we'll start with the Holman family. Walter Holman was a retired minister, and he bought over 200 acres of farmland in Corn Planter Township in 1837. He and his family then cleared that land. They raised buckwheat and pastured livestock, I think mostly sheep, if I understand correctly. Walter unfortunately passed away, and his sons Thomas and another Walter divided the land. Thomas owned what would eventually become Pithole City. It's basically, has anybody ever been out to Pithole before? Anybody? So hopefully some of you are familiar with it. What is now where the city was what Thomas owned, is basically divided by the Pithole Road. That's the little blacktop road that goes out there now. So that was, if I understand right, that was the dividing line between those two sons. And there was, I think, some of their other sons. There's other sons involved, but those were the two that got the closest land there and were most they got the most of it, I guess. So this is the Holman Farmhouse. This was after the town came about. They actually turned it into a little bit of a kind of a boarding house. They rented rooms to people that were drilling, and while the original drilling was going on, they actually opened the kitchen to feed some of these guys that were working, because there was a couple hundred people there every day just kind of looking, and they didn't, there was nowhere to go. It was a field, so they opened that to them then, and then eventually it was turned into a boarding house. And we'll see later that they're pretty smart business people, and they made out pretty good on this whole deal. So the Wildcatters came on January 30th of 1864. A couple of guys named Isaiah Frazier and James Faulkner leased 264 acres of land to drill for oil. The Holman family retained the rights on their 200 acres to 25% of the oil discovered. So that was pretty good. And then they began drilling in July. By January 7th of 1865, Frazier's well, which they called the United States well, it was also called the Frazier well because unfortunately Frazier didn't live to see its completion, so they named it for him. It came in at 250 barrels per day. And Kilgore and Keenan, who was another group of Wildcatters that started around the same time, they had what were called the twin wells. They came in 2 weeks later at close to the same. So we had these wells coming in with large amounts of oil, and people started flocking to this farmland, basically. This is kind of the scene from the United States well at some point in 1865. You see you got tanks, you've got barrels, you've got teamsters, lots of stuff going on. So a town is born. After the success of those wells, people came to the area looking for their own fortune. It wasn't just the drillers. There was also people that supplied the food and supplies and hauled the oil. Lots of different people started coming to take advantage of this new oil boom that happened in Pithole. A.P. Duncan and George Prather actually purchased the farm from the Holmans for $25,000 and laid out the streets and 500 lots. So it was a planned town in that way, but it wasn't really planned to last. It was laid out pretty well, but wasn't really laid out for a long period of time. They later actually gave the Holman family an additional $75,000, and they still kept the rights to their 25% of the oil on top of that. So, needless to say, the Holman family ended up in Cleveland with a very nice mansion, and they made out pretty well. They started selling these leases on the 24th of May in 1865. By mid-July, the population was at 2,000. By September, it was 15,000. So it was a pretty busy place during those few months. And that's what you have. You go from a field to this town. And if any of you said a few of you have been there, the visitor center now would be somewhere right in here on this hill by the churches up here. So this was a booming town. It's a field now. It was a field before, but it was built up in a hurry. And that's what we'll talk about next. In one 4-day period, 2 complete city streets were built up and opened for business. The first hotel was the Astor House, and that was built in the day. The story said that they sawed the logs that morning. Men were in the beds that night. Unfortunately, though, a lot of these structures were built very quickly, as you see with the Astor House, and from green lumber. So that wet green lumber is going to dry. It's going to warp. They didn't use any bricks or stones. It was all constructed very fast. And there's a story in the wintertime that says it was almost like walking through a sieve when you walk through the streets, because you could see the lights coming out of the house between the planks on the walls. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't built to last. It was built very fast. So that's the Astor House. And you can see, this is the first example you can really see. The front looks really nice, painted white. Got the nice windows in the porch and the board. Got nice writing on it. But then you look at the side, they didn't paint it. It's just plain wood. They built it fast. They built it to serve a purpose. They did what they had to, more or less. So we'll set the scene for the city of Pithole. There was a visitor quoted in the Titusville Herald that said the whole place smells like a camp of soldiers with diarrhea. So if you can imagine that. So not a lot of sanitation, and this is before plumbing, before a lot of our modern conveniences. Lack of clean water. They had very little groundwater, and the surface water was pretty quickly contaminated with all the oil around, and then of course everything was turned into mud by all the livestock and things like that. There were peddlers selling supposedly imported water by the cup, pitcher, or barrel at very exorbitant prices. I think it was, what was it? It was like 5 cents a cup or 50 cents a pitcher, or I don't know. It was expensive for back then anyway, but it was supposedly imported, but a lot of it most likely wasn't. They drilled a well and constructed a 25,000 gallon reservoir, and that really didn't help the water supply or the water quality, because it was again, if you've ever been there across the road from the visitor center, somewhere up where there's a kind of an old well site now, it kind of gets used as a campground. Somewhere up in there is where that reservoir was. There also was no lack of mud. Like I said, it formed pretty quickly and became almost impassable for humans and animals alike. And with all these people, it's also said there was twice as many horses and mules for transporting all this oil and other stuff. So you got 15,000 people and 30,000 horses and mules. You make a lot of mud. You make a lot of other things. And the streets definitely showed it. And that's, if you can see that picture, that's a horse that's kind of stuck laying in the mud, and you can see kind of how muddy things were at Pithole. And there's all kinds of stories in our video. We show there's, Pithole could give the muddiest place in the world a 3-foot head start and still beat it in depth of mud. And there are all sorts of stories about women too, because back then you'd wear your 7 or 8 layers with your petticoats and your skirts and all that fun stuff, and you'd have to cross the street somehow. And it was improper for a lady to have to show her ankle or anything like that. So if you couldn't get a nice man to come by and carry you across the street, you would have to, of course, hike up your dress and take off your shoes and stockings and kind of wade across the street. And they had barrels of water on the street corner so you could wash off your legs when you got across and put your shoes back on. So we'll see later there wasn't a whole lot of women. There's other reasons besides those conditions too, but we'll get into that. On July 15th of 1865, the population was estimated at 2,000 white males, 11 females, and 1 colored person. So, not a lot of women. The highest, the population was estimated at 20,000, still largely male. The majority of these 3,000 Teamsters, who were those young guys, they were mostly Irishmen that just came out of the Civil War. They were the ones that were hauling that oil in and out. They would usually haul barrels of oil out. They would haul wood or other supplies back in, and they made pretty good money doing that. They would charge like $3 a barrel to haul the oil out, which at one point was more than what the oil was worth. The first school was opened in the Methodist Church in December of 1866 with 30 students spread amongst 1st through 6th grades. The following year there was 45 students. So they did start a school for the short time they were there, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. The most births on one day was 4, and that was on November 29th of 1866. And that is actually probably when it was on its downturn more than anything. And that's a bunch of Teamsters. You can see just kind of how many of these guys there are grouped in that picture. So there's your young, probably Irish Teamsters, all at a dump station or something with their teams and their wagon loads of oil. So major hotels. It was home to about 57 hotels and boarding houses, and that was the quotas of varying sizes and reputations. And that also depended on your definition of a hotel. Some of these boarding houses were just, if you had it, like the Holmans turned their house into a boarding house. Some of them were definitely used for other things as well that we'll get into. The Bonta House was actually built in a suburb which was called Prather City, which was just across. Again, if you've ever been up there, if you're looking down off of our back porch on the visitor center, where the hill kind of goes up on the other side, that's where Prather City was. It was actually built for $80,000. It could accommodate 175 guests in 60 rooms. And less than 2 years later, it was sold to Franklin Tarbell for $600. So that was, I know those of you that have been around, we've been in the Tarbell house, so you've seen pieces of parts of that house, or that hotel. The Chase House was the most opulent hotel in the city. It cost $100,000. It could accommodate over 500 guests, and it had 132, I believe, rooms. It had a restaurant in it as well that was, I guess, it was considered one of the best restaurants in town as well, and it could seat 150 people. It also housed the post office, a bank, the stagecoach office, and a telegraph operator. And it was dismantled and rebuilt in Pleasantville, and it later burned down there. We have the Danforth House, which was built for $40,000, and it could accommodate 140,000, and it sold for $16 as firewood not long after that. And there was others. There's the Morey House, and I believe the Duncan House. There's a couple others that were considered really good hotels. These are the ones that we have good pictures of and that we know the most about. That's the Bonta House. You can see it's a really nice, big hotel. You can see it in the background of a lot of other pictures too, just because it is so big, and it kind of sticks out. It's on the hillside. So if you look, some of these probably your under braces for the balconies and things like that were what Marilyn was talking about that they have on their porch at the Tarbell house. So lots of connections there. That's the Chase House. The post office, I believe, is in this end maybe. There's a bank there. And that I think when it was rebuilt in Pleasantville, it had another kind of wing on the other side, so it got even bigger. But that's what it looked like at Pithole. And that's the Danforth house. That's probably the most well-known one that you see in pictures and in books and things of Pithole. And that's right at the corner of Holmden and First, the two main streets of Pithole. So the food and drink in town. The prices were very high due to the lack of supplies and the competition, because there was lots of different people trying to sell food and things like that in town. Oysters were actually a favorite, and there was a daily stagecoach delivering those from Baltimore, and so they had a fresh supply. And that's attributed to the fact that these guys were Civil War veterans, so they were down in the Chesapeake region. They got a taste for oysters, and since there was money being made up there, they could afford to bring them in, and there was a few places where you could buy oysters. We have a quote from a bakery employee that said that they actually, at one point, this speaks to the sanitation too, they started putting raisins in the bread to kind of mask the presence of flies. So it wasn't a very clean place. And excepting the hotels, the Wiggins restaurant was said to be the best restaurant, and I do have a picture of that one. I wasn't able to get it on here because we have a picture of that one. It was actually taken down and rebuilt in Tityute, and that's where we have a picture of it from, and we don't have a print right now, and our photographer hasn't been in to make one for us. But it is on the list now because it is a good picture. As I said, water was scarce. There was very few wells in town. Most were very shallow, and they had oil in them, so they weren't much good. Most restaurants actually had their water brought in by the barrel. Again, that's another job for those Teamsters. Most of the people purchased waters from those peddlers, and here I got the prices on this slide. 50 cents a barrel, eventually up to 50 cents a pitcher and 10 cents a cup. So water was very scarce, and they did. There was definitely a big business selling water up at Pithole because there wasn't a lot of it. And whiskey was less expensive than water and considered safer to consume. So there was a lot of that being consumed at Pithole. There was 61 businesses applied for liquor licenses when they, at one point. So lots of that. The Titusville Herald observed that every third place is supplied with beverages of questionable purity to quench throats at high prices. So lots of it. And it said many businesses actually had their own separate bar. They would just set up a bar counter and sell liquor. And of course a lot of them didn't have their liquor license. And that was actually used as a fund drive to start a school. We'll talk about that in a minute. So here are our churches. They had the Methodist Church, which was started by Reverend Darius Stedman. It was built and furnished for $9,500 and could seat 500 people. They had the Presbyterian, which was started by George Ormond for it cost $9,000 to build. It also could seat about 500 people, and it fell victim to a scheming pastor who emptied the treasury and ran away. So they never were really able to get too far, but they did have a nice building, and they made an effort anyway. The Roman Catholic Church was established by Joseph Finucane. It was named St. Patrick's due to the large percentage of Irish parishioners. Again, these Teamsters, they were really a driving force in the whole town, as we'll see, because this one did collapse after the Teamsters left. That drove a lot of them out. And that is a good picture. That kind of shows the opposite side of Pithole. You don't see the mud. You don't see kind of the hustle and bustle. You see people in their church clothes in front of this is the Presbyterian here. That's the Methodist there. And the visitor center would be just on this side of them over here somewhere right now. This where our picnic pavilion is. It would sit right. The pavilion would be right in front of the church here, and in between, I think the best we can figure, those are probably the parsonages in between there. And the Catholic Church was actually, if you're out there, if you're in the parking lot, you can see the street. It's 3rd Street that goes down over the hill. If the building's to your right, the pavilion's to your left. That's 3rd Street. If you go back up where those power lines go back up over on the opposite hill, that is about where the Catholic Church was, up over there. And I think there's a picture where you can kind of see it in the background. I think I put that one on here, so we'll see. So they did have a government. They held their first elections on December 11th of 1865. Alexander J. Keenan was elected Burgess. There was a 5-person council elected. They elected 3 school directors and 2 overseers of the poor. And they also built a jail and hired a police force. So they did have some semblance of order. At times, there was a lot of interesting police reports in the paper. That's a fun read. We'll talk about it a little more later. They actually did establish 2 volunteer fire companies, the Eagle Hose Company and the Charter Oak Hook and Ladder Company. And because there's a lot of fires, we'll talk about fires here in a minute, but that was one of the big things that hurt Pithole, and that kind of ties back to the poor construction and things like that. So businesses, there was a ton of cooperages and blacksmiths just kind of all over the place, and they were really the backbone of the town because these coopers were making the barrels and the tanks, and they were doing other things with wood. The blacksmiths, of course, were shoeing the horses. They were making the hoops for those barrels and tanks, and of course they were doing the tools for the oil rigs and things like that. So they were very important. There was a lot of them there, we have. I think the first lease was actually sold to a cooper. The post office was located at the Chase House, like I said. At one point, it was the 3rd busiest in the state, behind only Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and handled 3,000 pieces of mail each way per day. So it was very busy. There were several banks in the city. Many of them printed their own money, so it kind of made exchange between them a little difficult and sometimes almost impossible, especially if you left town with the money. That was before things were regulated too heavily, and yeah, there was some problems with that too. The town was actually home to 19 doctors at one point, and there was a dentist included in that. He advertised that he would remove teeth and things, so lots of those too. And this is, again, we'll talk about this a little later on, but like the bottom one here, many of these businesses, they would lease a room or a counter in their store to combine resources. So, and then some people would even make a small awning in the alleyway between 2 buildings. Just some people that didn't require a whole lot of room, just to I guess something got cut off there, but to house their businesses. We have a business directory, and we have a guy that's been trying for years to kind of map out the town and where everything was, but things were kind of moving so fast, and it was such a kind of a mishmash of where everything was, and where you have this business was located in the same building as this business because they just rented a counter or rented a room, and there's a lot of them that are rooms above this or rooms above that or rooms here or there, and it's kind of things happen everywhere. That's Holden Street. That's the main street. We got the Danforth House over here. You can see all the kind of the shingles hanging there, all the different businesses, and more on that side of the street. And this was after they already put their corduroy sidewalk in there, so this was probably a little later. But that kind of gives you an idea what Holden Street looked like, the main drag there in Pithole. That's another shot of Holden Street. That's a block further down. We have the Metropolitan Hotel, which was another hotel. The Hubs House, which is a boarding house. This is your convenience store, I think. That's the U.S. Drug Store there. So that's the Empire Store. I think that was kind of another. I think that might have been like your general store, maybe one of them. So then you can see again, there's a huge line of people, lots of people everywhere. Something I like to look at in a lot of these. Let's see, that one doesn't really have it. But if you look at a lot of these, you got people hanging out of the second-story windows, and some of them, if you look at them, they're women, and you might have a guess what some of those women might be doing hanging out of the window. This is First Street and Prather City in the background. So this is the office of J.E. Duncan and Co. That is the land office, and then over there on the hillside. So if you were walking out of the screen from this picture, walking this way, you would be walking towards. This was actually a little further down past the Danforth House, but you would be walking towards Prather City, and that's the Bonta House up there in Prather City. So you can see it was pretty big and dominated that hillside. This is the Grant Well office on Holden Street. So this, we have a replica of that at the museum. Just shows how small of a space they used to operate their oil business. out of, just a simple one-room building, more or less. And that was in 1865. And this is a shot of one of the front pages of the Pithole Daily Record, which was the newspaper. It was owned by a gentleman named Charles Leonard. He's known for kind of his humor. So you kind of have to, you didn't know whether he was telling the truth sometimes or not, but he tended to stretch things and make things funny. And like I said, there was a lot of interesting police reports. They published 6 days a week, and we have pretty much every one at the museum. We've got them all bound. We've got them bound by year for the most part. So, and they're interesting to look through. That was one of the things I did while I interned out there. They sent me those out, and I looked through them looking for articles, because we did, at one point, we reprinted one just to have some articles and just to have a little example to sell. And we were looking at doing another one. We haven't done it yet, but I picked out a few good articles, so we'll see. So, entertainment. Pithole was home to several theaters and other forms of entertainment. There was Murphy's Theater on First Street, which was very opulent, regularly hosted sold-out performances of Shakespeare, featuring nationally known artists. The Metropolitan Theater, which you saw the Metropolitan Hotel, it would have been just out of the picture on the left side of the hotel. It was more modest and hosted kind of variety shows, things like that. That one, though, the person that kind of sticks out, there was a guy named, I think it was Harry Hawk, who was one of the couple of performers that was on stage at the Ford Theater the night that Lincoln was assassinated. He performed at the Metropolitan Theater in Pithole. And they had Eloise Bridges. I don't think she was real well known, but she was one of the ones they featured at Murphy's quite a lot. They held a big benefit for her when she left. She was pretty well liked. There was a Madame Brignoli that was pretty well received, and I think she was maybe, I'm not sure which one she was at, possibly Murphy's. But they had a lot of these touring companies, and there was an ad in the, what was he? He was a one-legged something. He was one-legged dancer or something. I don't know. There's ads in the paper at one point. He lost his glove, and they put in the paper that he could go at it with one leg, but not with one glove or something like that. So we're looking for his glove. The Athenaeum Theater was home to more body entertainment, which included bare-knuckle boxing and other exhibitions. There was 50 baseball-loving residents that established the Stella Club in May of 1866. And they held games at a diamond that was on 2nd Street, which, I don't know, we held a couple of 1860 rules baseball games out there. We're supposed to be having another one in June here. And it's apparently close to where we do it now, which we didn't know that. We just picked that because it's one of the only flat spots out there. So, but yeah, they did do that. They weren't very good. They had a couple of box scores in the paper. I don't ever remember seeing them win one, but they played baseball out there too. There was also several billiards parlors, bowling alleys, and social clubs. There was the Swordsman's Club, the 40 Thieves, and they had other different groups that got together and they held balls and did different things. And something that we always chuckle about at the museum, there was, I think, the Plymouth Rock Bowling Alley. It was located on the 2nd floor of a business. So you had a bowling alley overhead of whatever other business it was, which is a little different. And this picture, you can't really see it too well here, but this is a saloon here, and that sign there says billiards, and this that is Prather Street there. So and this one's Carpenters and Joiners, and if you could read that one, it says coffins made to order. So that was a little difference right there in front of that picture. And again, you can see a little bit of the mud and stuff down here. So there was a lot of debauchery as well. There was a lot of legitimate businesses, but there was also a lot of not so legitimate businesses. There was numerous brothels and gambling houses. At one point, there was over 400 prostitutes in town. Most of them were teenagers, and a lot of them weren't there on their own choice. A large population of the young males, like these young Irish teamsters, they fueled these enterprises for a lot of the lifespan of the city. So these teamsters, they were making the equivalent of like $1,000 a day now, and they just came out of the war. They wanted something to do to blow off some steam, to have some fun, so they gave a lot of money and to these women and the drinking houses and things like that. And let's see. I don't know, it was something else. I'm drawing a blank here. But yeah, there was a lot of that stuff going on. And most of that was on First Street. That's in the middle of First Street, you kind of have that Murphy's Theater, which was one of the biggest buildings in town. Had Shakespeare. It was a very nice building. And then First Street was also kind of known as your red light district, where a lot of these brothels and other things like that were. So it was kind of a contrast that way, and also shows that there's really no rhyme or reason to things out there. And let's see here. Oh, so this is Holman Street. The Danforth house will be right across the road, so it's right down the main drag. And what you can see here is a shingle for the new idea. And we have our one volunteer that likes to say that the new idea was anything but a new idea. That was a brothel, and it was right in the middle of Holman Street in the middle of downtown, where most of the legitimate businesses were. So that's one of them that we know where it was. That's another problem. Our gentleman that has been trying to map out these businesses and map out the places. These brothels and a lot of these gambling houses didn't advertise. So they weren't listed in the business directory. So you'd get your street numbers, and then there'd be huge gaps, and maybe that's where they were, or maybe, we don't know for sure. But we know they didn't advertise, and a lot of them were also, like one was called Heenan's Cottage, so it didn't, and there was one that was the Florentine restaurant, I think, and that was one of the more notorious ones. And it was a restaurant that was really a front for a brothel. And really, in the paper you might see them, they would say something about serving girls or something like that, but that was the hint you had, and other than the ones that got mentioned in the paper, you really didn't know a whole lot of them for sure, but yeah, they were there, and there was a lot of them scattered around in different places. So now we start to decline. The Van Sickle pipeline went in, I believe, in early 1866, and it worked so well that it put the Teamsters out of work, and it kind of started a domino effect. They could haul significantly more oil than what the Teamsters could, and they could do it they charged $1 a barrel. The Teamsters were charging $3, so they put the Teamsters out of business. And they weren't very happy about that, but that kind of started it. These young men, they had lots of money to spend and were spending it, left town. So that took care of a lot of it. And then the production dropped off. They were sucking a lot of oil out of the same general area. It was starting to dry up. So and there was more fields springing up. So they would move on to Parker, move on to Petroleum Center, move on to further south or further east, and just kind of moving on out of there. And many fires ripped through the city. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. The hasty construction and the presence of a lot of oil and natural gas were the largest catalysts. That was a big part of it. You had the gas fumes hanging around. You had oil-soaked everything. There were even a few cases where they were trying to put out fires with a bucket brigade, because again, they didn't have water, they didn't have anything like that, and then they couldn't figure out why they weren't making any progress. And then somebody looked in one of their buckets, and there was oil in the water, so they were just making it worse. And the leases that Prather and Duncan sold stated that any improvements or structures would return to the lessor when the agreement was terminated. So a lot of times their house burned down, they didn't really want to spend the money to rebuild, when if they left it would just go back to them anyway. And that you did see a lot of people would just take down their houses and take it with them. And that's a lot of them, they sold and moved elsewhere. We've heard a few stories of that. So kind of these unfortunate circumstances, and like I said, new oil towns, the town kind of died out awful quick. And this is the ruins of one of the fires. This is on the flats, which is below everything that we have cleared today. That's where most of the oil wells were. This is, again, that's the Duncan office again, so you can see one ripping through down there. And this is kind of how Pithole eventually died. By 1868, the population was back down to 2,000 people. So you go December of 1865, 15,000. 3 years later, you're down to 2,000. By the 1870 census, which was the closest one to when there was actually a town there was only 281 residents in Pithole. They annulled the charter in 1877. A year later, that same parcel of land that sold for $2 million in 1865 sold for $4.37. The former a gentleman that used to live there named Edward Twitchell purchased that whole tract for $175, and he cleared some of it and had a small farm until 1934. And surprisingly enough, with everything that went on, kind of ironically, the last building that was standing was the Methodist Church, and it was there until the 1930s. And this is 1886. This is 1895. This is the corner of First Street and Holman Street. So the Danforth house was like right here. So this is where that one was, and it's that same shot almost. So that's, and you can see the deep wagon ruts. Those were there for a long time. Afterwards, they were smoothed over when James B. Stevenson bought it, and a little later on, I think probably after the 1930s. This is 1934, and there's something I do want you to notice in this one. That's the back of the Methodist Church that you can still see up there. So, and this one, if you look, the visitor center again would be about right here. So what we have cleared out would be probably just right kind of where this clear spot is already there. So that's kind of what today, if you go over there, that's what you'll be able to see, is kind of this hillside. Oh, that's that again. And then I just highlighted a few people here. This is Reverend Derrick Stedman, that was the pastor of the Methodist Church. He was the chaplain of the 105th Pennsylvania, which was the Wildcat Regiment, until he contracted typhus. He also, in town, served on many committees and started the school. And the way he did that, I kind of hinted at before. He went through town and he wrote down all the names of people that were selling alcohol without a license, and he turned them into the county seat at Franklin. And at that time, if you turned somebody in and they got fined, you got half the money. So he used that money and he started a school. And apparently nobody really asked him about that, questioned him about that. It was something that needed done, and that was his way of getting it done. He was one of the most respected and revered men in the city. He was different from your typical Methodist minister. He wore a beard, and he did on occasion strap on his revolvers from the war. And after a short time, he moved his wife and daughters to Chautauqua for a year, just to kind of keep them out of the rough conditions that were around. But they did. Where did he stay? I think he stayed in a cooperage his first night there, and then he lived in the church. And he also had an interaction with some of the other people. We'll talk about that when we get to them. And that's this guy right here. So this is Ben Hogan. He was born Benedict Hagen to Austrian immigrants. He traveled the country in various capacities, including spying and serving for both armies during the Civil War. He ran blockades. He did a little bit of spying. And he also was a renowned strongman and boxer. And when he came to Pithole, he operated a gymnasium, a saloon, and also a brothel. And he actually, the funny story about him was, after he was known as the wickedest man in the world, he was one of the people that was responsible for kind of bringing these young women against their will to Pithole to be prostitutes. He and French Kate, who we'll talk about next, put an ad in a paper for wanting like a housemaid or something like that. A woman answered it, or probably a teenager answered it, from New York State. She came to town and was informed that she wasn't really going to be a housemaid. She was going to be kind of a prostitute, and she refused to do that. So he locked her in a room, and they were going to basically starve her until she agreed to do what they wanted. And she managed to somehow write a letter that she dropped out the window, and somebody picked it up and mailed it. And her mother came to town and found Ben Hogan, and he denied knowing her. So she went and she saw the churches up on the hill. She went and found Reverend Stedman, and he rounded up some friends and grabbed his Civil War revolvers, and they went and talked to Ben Hogan, and he didn't like his odds against 6 guys with guns, so he did give her up, and she went home with her mother. So that was another Stedman story and a little bit about Ben Hogan. But he moved on. He started I think Petroleum Center, and he went to Parker's Landing, and he had an interesting story. It was between the Allegheny River ran right through near Parker, And it was illegal to have a gambling house in either, I think it was Clarion and Armstrong County that goes down through there. So he got the idea. He took a big paddle wheel boat, basically, a big steamer, and turned it into a floating hotel. It was his floating pleasure palace, I think he called it. And he docked it right in the middle of the river so neither side could get him. And they advertised they were pretty serving girls, and they also advertised that every day at a certain time, these girls would go bathe in the river. And for a little bit of money, you could watch, and for more, you could join them. So that was one of his enterprises. And later on, like I said, he was traveling through New York City on his way, I think, to Paris, if I remember right. And he heard kind of a party going on, or so he thought. And he walked in, and it was, I think, an evangelist service or something like that. And he kind of came out a changed man, and he found religion. Came back through the oil region, trying to kind of right some wrongs. He drew big crowds when he spoke. Part of the reason probably because some of the people that showed up were a little worried about what he might have to say. And he ended up dying in a mission in Chicago, actually. So he kind of completely changed himself. But he was one of the more infamous people at Pithole. And then we have probably the most infamous madam in Pithole was French Kate. She was a widow of a Confederate officer. She was said to have spied for the CSA and conspired with John Wilkes Booth. And though we don't really know that for sure, that was just kind of a speculation. She became Hogan's business partner and mistress, and they together managed a brothel, and she went with him to his next town or two. And then she kind of falls off the map. We don't even know her real name for sure. It's been seen as Kate Granger and Catherine LeCompte, but after she leaves him, we don't really know what happened to her. So, and this is Samuel Van Sickle. He constructed the pipeline. It covered 5 miles between Pithole and Miller Farm, and it definitely saw heavy opposition from the Teamsters because it put them out of business. It's credited as the first oil pipeline in the world, and we have the historical markers out on 227. So, Charles Vernon Culver, he was a businessman, he was a banker and a congressman. He planned to construct the Reno, Oil Creek, and Pithole Railroad, and also was instrumental in development of the city of Reno and several other kind of businesses and buildings along the route of this railroad. He attracted several prominent investors, including J.J. Vandergrift, and it failed pretty spectacularly, and he became known as somewhat of a con man. That's kind of up for debate in some cases, but he spent some time in jail and had a history of kind of not paying back his debts and things like that. So yeah, that's kind of, he's got an interesting story himself. This is Postmaster D.W. Bailey. He started as the apprentice and later became postmaster at Pithole City Post Office. And he was captain of Company B of the 78th U.S. Colored Troops. So that he was kind of different in that way, and he was in charge of that very busy post office for a while. And we have the neat picture of him all kind of in his dress blues there from the Army. And these are a couple of more characters that we don't have pictures of. That is Charles Crocus Leonard, the publisher of the newspaper. Like I said, he's known for his satire, and he was a Civil War veteran as well. He sustained some injuries, and he actually later wrote a book that's called The History of Pithole, which I'm told is interesting. I haven't read it yet. I want to at some point. I haven't taken the time to yet. Then we have Widow Ricketts. She was known as the Oil Princess. We don't know her first name, where she came from. But she was a laundress and owned one of the very few water wells that was in Pithole. Her well was pumped dry as part of a firefighting attempt. They ran a bucket brigade. The next day, she went out and her well was pumping oil instead of water. And her production and the sale of lots on her lease produced a healthy profit for herself. She divided her lot into like 6-foot square leases and sold them. And people bought them, and she made lots of money. Unfortunately, her well turned back to water, and she actually went back to being a laundress. And her house was actually later pulled down to keep another fire from spreading. So But yeah, and it's also said she turned down several marriage proposals while she was kind of raking in the money from her little oil business there. So that was pretty interesting. She has a pretty interesting story too. Then we have Father Finucane, who I mentioned. He was born in Ireland in 1841, came to the U.S. in his early 20s. He came to Pithole on a mission, actually, a mission trip. He established the Catholic Church. He served on many of the town committees as well. He took charge of the Catholic Church in Franklin while he was in Pithole. And he was another, like Stedman, one of the more respected people in town. We have Alexander Keenan, who is another highly respected person. He was the first Burgess. He set out to shut down all the bars and brothels. Didn't really work out. He started a short-lived debate club, so that's one of those social clubs. He served the city in several other capacities. And he was one of the last holdouts. He stayed there until the 1870s, so he was there for quite a while. These are almost people of Pithole. We have Ambrose Burnside, who you may have heard of. He was hired as the chief engineer and president and was also in charge of constructing that Reno, Oil Creek, and Pithole Railroad that Culver was trying to construct. That project was another one of Culver's that didn't work out. It was stalled by weather and poor decisions, which Burnside was kind of known for from his generalship in the Civil War, and it never was completed. John Wilkes Booth actually was in the area. He never made it to Pithole. He was kind of dead before Pithole took off. But in late 1863, he invested $6,000 and formed the Dramatic Oil Company. They drilled the Wilhelmina well in 1864, and it was a very successful well. And they tried to increase that success by shooting it, and it did the opposite and ruined it. And while he had the money, he also invested $1,000 for a 1/30th lease at Heiner Farm on Pithole Creek. So he came close. He was on Pithole Creek, just not in Pithole. That well didn't pan out. So he eventually lost all that money and left the business. And of course, there's all the what ifs. If he had struck it rich here in Pennsylvania in 1864, would he have still felt the need to shoot the president in 1865? We don't know, but it's always speculated. And that's what I got. Another picture, that's the Metropolitan Hotel there, I believe, and some guys from behind a wagon. So, any questions? All right, and if you have any more, most of you guys have my email address. So you know,
how about the groundwater? You know, you said there was no groundwater to speak of. Was it just polluted, or was it?
Yeah, it was pretty well. There was
pretty wet there in some of those pictures.
Yeah, there was a couple of small creeks, but it got polluted pretty quick with all they took all the trees out, so there's lots of runoff, lots of mud, lots of animal filth and all kinds of fun. And yep, no problem.
Well, thank you, Lee. I'll mention for our guests and others, this club meets at 6 o'clock on the second Wednesday of every month. Often it's here at Perkins in Meadville. Sometimes we meet elsewhere, but we usually put a notice in the paper. Again, thank you.